All right, this is Mr. P with lesson number 8. If you didn't do lesson 7 or the previous ones, you want to go back. So I'm picking up with the very end. I kind of had to rush through the story at the end of the last video. That 15 minutes came up rather quickly. But I have to correct one thing I said in the last video. I mentioned that Dr. Ocean Sweet, the black doctor who moved into a white neighborhood, I mentioned it was in Chicago. It was actually in Detroit. My apologies. Dr. Ocean Sweet moved into a white neighborhood in Detroit. A white mob formed. Detroit had become Klan country. About 35,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan were in Detroit. And the white mob formed to try and kick him out. He defended him, or they armed themselves to defend themselves. Tension was rising, and the police ended up arresting Dr. Ocean Sweet and his family members. And they were in jail. They, got a trial. It was a hung trial, meaning it, got thrown out. They retried, and he did get acquitted. But it is important to recognize that he ultimately had to move into what was known as the Black Bottom, black neighborhood in Detroit. So white or northern cities maintained racial segregation by force and with legal power as well. Restrictive covenants, things that we're going to talk about in a later unit. But essentially, that experience that Lawrence highlights here, the climb that you have to continue to make, the segregation, the segregated justice system, all of this tells us that the experience in the North was not full freedom. I asked you in the last video to close out by reconsidering the name of the Great Migration, right? Do you think that it should be renamed? Why or why not? And if you think it should be renamed, what name would you give to this migration? So take a moment to do that in your notebooks, do some critical thinking around that. How does the Great Migration capture does the name capture why people are leaving, what they're fleeing from? How should we understand this migration? Should we call it the Great Migration? Should we call it something else? So if you didn't do that in the last video, pause and do that now, and then come back. So for this video, we want to look at the New Negro art movement and movement in 1894 to 1925. I mentioned this when we studied Jim Crow racist caricature, but this provides the background to the Harlem Renaissance, so it's important that we revisit it here in more detail. And so we want to have an understanding of how this provides some of the backdrop to the Harlem Renaissance and how Black folks were creating an art to interpret their reality and to use it as a tool to combat oppression as well. So a reminder that the New Negro movement was a counterattack against the racist caricature of the time period. We see, racist caricature of the time period of various kinds of caricatures, whether it's dandy caricature, coon caricature, etc. This is a time period when Blackness was seen as a source of entertainment. Caricatures of Blackness, to be more precise, was seen as a source of entertainment, something to be laughed at, and Black communities, Black intellectuals, try to fight back against that from the very beginning. And that's what leads to the New Negro movement. Part of what they're fighting back against is these minstrel shows, right, where white folks performed caricatures of Blackness as professional entertainment, right? They profited off of this. I say mostly whites because there are a few instances of a couple of Black folks who profit off of this as well, who also put on blackface and portray themselves not as the Black people that they are or as any real Black person, but as caricature also. And so we want to, that's something to recognize too. But right, to be sure, this is mostly whites who are performing caricature. So W.E.B. Du Bois is a crucial figure in the New Negro movement. He was someone who stood at the forefront of the counterattack, as Henry Louis Gates mentions here, fighting back against those negative images. And the way that he does so is by curating an exhibit. You can see here in 1900, he presented the exhibit of American Negroes at the Paris Exposition in France. He selected 363 Black and white photographs that represented Black achievement. And in the following photographs, we'll see some of these photographs, right? Notice hairstyles, notice skin tone, notice clothing as we look through these. Very Victorian clothing, very much assimilationist in terms of the message of like, we can assimilate into white middle class values and presentation also. That's part of how, sometimes, and this is important to recognize, sometimes Black counterattacks to racist caricature is assimilationist, right? So the racist caricature is segregationist, and the fight against that adopts assimilationist ideas to argue, look, we can assimilate, and that pressure, right, recreates itself in some of the Black intellectual resistance at the time period. And there's a reason why very few of these 363 photos portray anybody of a darker skin tone. That's something to recognize, right? And it's also important to recognize that everyone in these images are Black. Even as some of these folks, might be somewhat white presenting in a certain way. He chose these folks intentionally. And this leads into the politics of respectability, right? So the New Negro movement reflected assimilationist ideas and the class divide between historically free Black communities in the North and Southern Black migrants to the North. So part of what happens is you end up with Southern Black migrants moving to the North. And these historically free Black communities, meaning that they were free prior to emancipation and are the descendants of free Black communities, not descendants of people who had been enslaved, or at least, in recent history. And so it reflects these divisions within the Black community. It's a reflection of those divisions. So we can read here by Henry Louis Gates. He writes, in the Paris exhibit, Du Bois had offered up images of Black people cloaked in the politics of respectability. The politics of respectability stressed the embrace of white Victorian middle-class social and moral values, and it emphasized that Black people should comport themselves in public as thoroughly middle class. As we might expect, Du Bois and other Black leaders at the time dressed like middle-class white Americans, and they were careful to speak in standard English as opposed to Black dialect. Right, in Black dialect, or AAVE, African American Vernacular English, is recognized by linguists as a legitimate, right, dialect of English, yet it's not considered standard or, quote unquote, proper English. So, Black intellectual leaders of the New Negro movement, they comported themselves and assimilated into that white middle classness. The public face and voice of Black people were carefully crafted to refute negative racist stereotypes that were in circulation at the time. So, we want to recognize that process here. There was a debate as to how this quote unquote New Negro movement should operate. Should it be led by, intellectuals, or should it be led by someone like Booker T. Washington, who was an intellectual, but he had a different approach to resistance, in that he did not advocate for resistance to white supremacy. He advocated for accommodationism. So while Du Bois unveiled his concept of the talented 10th, referring to the best and brightest African Americans as the vanguard, who would lead their progress of their race, Du Bois later recants that and says that was an elitist, classist kind of approach, that, all Black people have the potential to lead themselves into progress, not just the top formally educated elite. Booker T. Washington took a different approach to African American progress. The most frequently quoted line of his Atlanta Compromise speech, you can research and look and read more of that, in all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet one as the hand in all things essential to mutual progress. So essentially, he accepted Jim Crow segregation, de jure by law, legal segregation in social and political matters, with the hope that this accommodation would appease radical segregationists and enable the mass of Black people in the South slowly but steadily to achieve economic progress through manual labor and the trades. Washington advocated for practical industrial education over impractical liberal arts. He writes, "No race can prosper till it learns that there is as much dignity in tilling the field as writing a poem." So certainly he has a point, right? That like any work is dignified, should be dignified work. The point that a lot of people take issue with in him is his accommodationist stand, right? That this notion that one does not need to resist segregation but appease it and just better themselves. This Washington embodies the Black trend of pull yourself up by your bootstraps kind of ideology. So Du Bois was more of an intellectual elitist at the time who also wanted to resist, right? He forms the NAACP. He does take active resistance modes, certainly not militant modes, but legal modes of resistance. Du Bois's double consciousness theory, I want you to consider how the photography exhibit of 1900 illustrates this theory. So I'll read this and then you can pause and think about it. So art historian Deborah Willis says that with their images, referring to those photographs we looked at, of self-empowerment, self-determination, self-recovery, these photos themselves constitute a double mythos, which Du Bois would call a double consciousness. The one projected on the Black community by its own members to counter the one projected on the Black community by the dominant culture, white supremacist culture. Du Bois writes in his book, The Souls of Black Folks, this American world yield the Negro no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of the other world. It is a peculiar sensation, this double consciousness, this sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one's soul by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two souls, two thoughts, two unreconcilable strivings, two warring ideals in one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. Apart. What, after all, am I? Am I an American or am I a Negro? Can I be both? This is Du Bois articulating this notion that it goes back to Frederick Douglass's 4th of July speech, right? This country was not designed for Black people. It was designed to be built on the backs of Black people for, as a white country. That is the design. So Du Bois considers that and looks, how can a Black person understand and see themselves in their Blackness without looking through the white gaze, meaning the racist caricature, right? Caricatures are false, so the rejection of that caricature is to look through oneself through their own, right, consciousness, which is a resistance to and a fight against, a counteraction against the white supremacist caricature of the time. So that would be the photographs that Du Bois exhibits, right? The middle class assimilationist photographs. But where does Blackness exist in this country? Does it only exist in the assimilationist stance? Where is the chance for Blackness to emerge as an affirmation of all that it is? Its Africanness nature, its American nature. What's existing in that hyphen? And that's what Du Bois is trying to grapple with, right? Can one be truly both? Does being an American mean that one needs to assimilate? Will white America ever truly accept Black America? That's what Du Bois is kind of battling with, and he's battling with it internally. How can one see themselves and their Black identity without looking at it through an assimilationist lens? How does one reject the white gaze? This is the task of Black artists. Toni Morrison, Langston Hughes, these are Black writers and artists whose goal in many ways is to embrace Blackness without assimilating. But this is what Du Bois is wrestling with. So take a moment to write a reflection on what I discussed on the quote. How does the photography illustrate this theory? How can you see this theory in today's world? Just pause and try to wrestle with this. It's a lot, and I wish I could wrestle with it in you and we could do pair shares and talk about it in class. But I wrestle with it on your own, do some more research on it. It's quite profound and powerful what Du Bois articulates here. Okay, we're going to have to do the next slide in the next video. So, I'll stop this video and you can wrestle with Du Bois' self-consciousness theory. Feel free to email me questions and thoughts as well, or write a reflective practice journal about it. All right, I'll see you in the next video.